Hi, I'm Carolyn Medine. I teach at the University of Georgia. I'm a professor in the religion department, and I'm a professor and the director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Georgia. Um, there's not much more I'll say about myself. I just wanted to announce that the Institute for African American Studies was finally added to the signage in the building we're in, so we officially exist. In Vincent Wimbush's installation Masquerade, we sailed with Gustavus Vasa, as he called himself, crisscrossing, cutting across the Black Atlantic, 2 continents in multiple places, including the Arctic. Many critics turn to Victor Turner and Rites of Passage and the Lemon to analyze this figure who is Equiano and Vasa, slave and free, African prince and black salt, one who was transnational before we used the word, and cosmopolitan. Along with Lemon, I also suggest contemplating contact zones and the complex reality of home and doubleness characterizing diaspora. With these in mind, I walk through the exhibit responding to the triptych, which I'm going to call Black Masks, White Masks, and Vasa signifying narrative and New World adaptations. Finally, I want to speak of Black Salt, Black British sailors and their impact. Black Masks. Vasa is 11, he tells us, when he is taken. He may have been younger. In his life in Africa, he spends most of his time with his mother and his sister. He had not, it seems, been through rites of passage to manhood, any initiation into the world of the incarnate being, which is called masquerade. The masquerade, the theatrical art form of performing the mask, embodies the essence of African civilization, Raphael Njoku argues, translating meaning. The mask, which does not so much conceal as make real, tells us we are under masquerade, that we are in a time, for example, when an ancestor enters and initiates a lemon. The masquerade, which maintains balance and social order, is the human and with experiencing the gods and the ancestors, the embodiment of tradition and a guarantee of continuity, and a tradition that is unique, Njoku says, because of its ability to walk, talk, and dance, express emotions and drama, or create humor, fight, carry out justice, and even predict the future. Young Equiano does not get to experience all of African masquerade. He's one of many Igbo children taken in the slave trade, including infants. He recovers it in memory, but also likely is in his encounters with the Igbo in the New World, particularly in the West Indies. The slave ship is his rite of passage. He is so young when taken that he has to use other sources, books like that of Alexander Falconbridge, I suppose, to supplement his memory. As a sailor, Vasa moves to the center, to the metropole, and out on ship. He loves London, but can you be there and not go mad? Are you just a black skin and a white mask? The center, Conrad says, is a whited sepulcher. To live its logic is to be immune to terror, Vasa tells us, naming what Zizek via Derrida calls the magic of the cogito. Even Vasa, he says, quote, grew a stranger to terror of every kind, and in that respect was at least almost an Englishman. Almost is important. The further we move from Africa in the narrative, the more contingent and brutal life becomes, and the more we experience white masks. White masks, book covers. Enlightenment masks, white books, assert power through epistemic hegemony. From the epistemologies of Kant and Descartes to the ethical economies of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, and under the many other masks of Enlightenment rationality, there seems to be, Charles Long argues, no soul stuff. Unlike the masquerade of the African masks, no divine beings appear. Enlightenment reason decides who has reason, and as Long reminds us, twice creates those unreasonable ones who undergo its creativity. They are created from the human being oriented in time and space in masquerade, into doubleness at the hands of, under the scalpels of, through the discourse of, by the torture of, and capitalist conversion of, under the mask of, the mad cogito, whose brutal curiosity needs to know at any cost. Doubleness keeps us sane. Not to be double, Long argues, in modernity is to be mad. The rational language of books masks a delighted dismemberment, ultimately dismembering the dismemberer. As Leah Kamanson, as Leo Kalmanson argues, the modernist self cannot center. Therefore, it engages in ongoing repetition and increasingly extreme experience that leads nowhere. Its suspension of the subject at an uncrossable border is both exhausting and disempowering. And conflating nothingness with the limit of a certain type of phenomenological interiority, death, Kalmanson argues, becomes a stand-in for all manner of trans-egoic experiences. Nietzsche called this objective man a tool and a mirror with no end in himself, submitting to everything in a banal madness, engaged in a banality of evil, which may be at the core of the Western cogito and has ideologically supported the terror of history. Remasking to unmask, signifying. Voss's book wears the mask of a slave narrative. Just as the masquerade needs the body to animate it, so too do slave narratives, which needed the slave, the abolitionist, and the body politic. They were bestsellers, shaped by certain conventions, like the whipping of half-naked Black women that shocked, angered, and titillated their audiences. Like the masquerade, these narratives occupied an interstitial space between the African and American, the public and the private, the self and the other, slavery and freedom, autobiography and persuasive logic or ideological weapon. They were, in a sense, a type, giving the narratives, James Olney argues, overwhelming sameness. Yet, as John Sikora puts it, they contained a Black message, sealed within a white envelope. This envelope made the slave narrative questionable for Georgia historian Ulrich Phillips as testimony. Remember, I bring him up because Vossa says that Georgia had some of the worst slavery, and he was nearly beaten to death here. Phillips was the dominant voice in assessing slavery in the 20th century. His racist American Negro slavery of 1918 still shapes how some view slavery today, as it pictured slavery as paternal and pastoral. The envelope made Phillips assess the slave narrative as inauthentic and biased. But Vossa is too big for the envelope, and when he's wedged in, he tears it. His life was not typical of most slaves, or even of most people in his time. Signifying, he calls his narrative a memoir. In a memoir, the story is more important than it be completely historically accurate. Memoirs are dialogical and invitational, and they exhibit a personal style. A memoir creates a lens, a way of seeing it. The writer directs our attention, as Vossa tells us that his narrative is interesting. Vossa, writing memoir, is at play in British and American culture, playing on all the available genres to draw in his audience: spiritual autobiography, captivity narrative, travel and adventure story, economic treatise, and apologia. His narrative is much more disruptive than prescriptive. Vossa's story helped shape the anti-slavery movement, though some in it worried that he was too atypical. He certainly acquires and masters white magic, even using the Bible himself. But more than that, he puts his spell in the book. Having mastered the white magic, the technologies of reading and writing, he addresses us directly, drawing us into his narrative to witness, fearing to bore us, and even asking God to give us right understanding of his aims. He traveled through Britain selling his book, drawing white money. In many ways, he reminds me more of Sojourner Truth than Douglass. In the image Dr. Wimbush put up, you could see Truth, who also was a traveler who took control of her story. And she sold the shade, the photographs of herself and her narrative, to sustain the substance, though she did not, like Equiano, end up wealthy. Adaptation, New World masks. The Igbo were masters at adaptation under oppression, and they adapt Masquerade. Masquerade in the New World drew on multicultural origins from the Roman Catholic Carnival of Venice beginning in the 12th century to 18th century British masquerades, which, though class distinctions mostly held, made a challenge to social order, opening a space of potential. Indeed, the costume of the masquerade, for example, the domina, was a symbol of crossing from the realm of what was into the realm of what might be, an opening of freedom to imagine a perfected human community, free of the ravages of difference and alienation. Song, music, and costume and dance were part of these forms. And Njogu argues that the masquerade can open performative models of dialogue around social issues. In the New World, the Spanish, Portuguese, and French, beginning in the 15th century, brought the Roman Catholic Shrove Tuesday Carnival, which itself was adapted from pagan festivals into the New World, where it intersected with African masquerade. Celebrated in Catholic centers that were diasporic sites, it's a mixed form, with many of its elements, like percussive rhythms and dancing styles, coming from Africa. These create a hybrid celebration of what was a European event. Just an aside, if we think about Akile Mbembe's assertion that in Africa, quote, Christianity in practice was turned upside down, undone, and then outfitted in masks, all without being stripped of its core concept, we see in Carnival scripturalization in a double sense of African slaves re-Africanizing a Christianity that they had already Africanized. What we can see is how Masquerade gave voice to the silenced voices of the enslaved and even contributed to slave revolts. We might then argue with Charles Long through Du Bois that though specifics of African life may have been lost, a style of being persisted in the New World. These came together powerfully in the contact zone that was the British West Indies that Vasa entered, where Igbo slaves, by the force of their numbers, influenced music, dance, and masquerade, and where slaves not only influenced each other interculturally, but also transformed the culture and lifestyles of their masters as well. Here enters what Long calls the oppressive element in the religion of the oppressed. Whether with complete memory or not, the diaspora reaches back to the mythic. In these New World adaptations, the consciousness of the hold of the slave ship ignites a double consciousness in those who were on deck, recreating the god under a new sun in a modern masquerade that the oppressor participates in, playfully, but potentially changing his consciousness. In masquerade and in the slave narrative, therefore, knowledge of the slave may overcome the logic of the master, opening in the master a double consciousness that may suggest new forms of freedom. This is Paul Gilroy's negative dialectic of conviviality, dwelling with difference in a fragile planetary humanism. In these interactions, racism does not disappear, but forms of comprehension and communication can emerge to produce everyday virtues or convivial capabilities that enrich life. Diasporic home, as Toni Morrison has written, is not evil, is not Eden. It is a doable human activity. The whispers from the hold, from behind the mask, offer transformative knowledge. And as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man whispers to his audience, who knows, but on the lower frequencies, I speak for you. Black salt. In the center stands the black salt. When young Vasa is on the slave ship, he thinks it moves and stops by magic, but he masters the white man's magic. On the liminal sea, as a sailor in the Royal Navy, Vasa experienced relative equality. Vincent Coretta, his biographer, writes that Vasa found an almost, quote, utopian microscopic alternative to the slave-infested greater world. And one reviewer suggests that on these ships, he saw a model for relationships between Europeans and Africans. The liminality of the sea offers, it seems, a site for self-exploration, for controlling and shifting identities. Remember, the first 6 slave narratives published in English before 1800 were written by Black sailors, who in the maritime trade had access to the whole African diaspora. On the ship, Vasa, as Matthew Brown puts it, masters other voices as he learns to master the ship. He gains mobility, which plantation slaves lack. Though Vasa does not himself speak directly of it, we can guess that these sailors carried knowledge that fueled resistance and abolition. Brown calls this the sailor's telegraph, a network of information that flowed through free Black and enslaved sailors in the diaspora, men who acted as conduits between slave and free. This is not to say that Vasa did not experience the fear of being re-enslaved. He was terrified of impressment and the difficulties of racism. Still, in Vasa's time, Black sailors found the rules of the ship, like the rule of the street in the masquerade of Carnival, unexpectedly free. In conclusion, Vasa masquerades under multiple liminal identities and signifies. He remasks Western forms. He is, for example, Black and British. I said, remember the almost. He can never be English. That's an ethnic distinction. But he can become British. Therefore, his identity always carries an unsettling excess, which we see in that cover that is at the top of your screen. His masquerade, his signification is, I think, calling himself the African. Under that signifying sign, he does identity, asserting a full humanity in a double diasporic mode that talks back to the mad cogito of the West. As Equiano's childhood fear, astonishment, and wonder become Vasa's knowledge and capability, his mastery ultimately gives him the tools to set himself and ultimately others free.